So I'm gonna introduce myself a little bit and tell you a little bit about where I came from, how I came to poetry. I grew up in Northeast Tennessee. I'm coming to you tonight from Johnson City, Tennessee, and this is my Facebook debut, by the way. I've been a social media holdout all along, and I thank my wife Lisa for helping me navigate this technology. And she's a West Virginia native too, so um, I appreciate the help with that. I grew up in Northeast Tennessee. As I said, I'm coming to you now from Johnson City, Tennessee. I'm an English professor at East Tennessee State University, um, where I've been since 2009. And it's a couple of hours from where I grew up, which is Sharps Chapel, Tennessee. It's sort of right between Knoxville, Tennessee, and Middlesboro, Kentucky, if that places it on a map for you. Probably won't unless you're from these parts. I've published a handful of poetry books. I've worked a good bit on editing projects. I've edited 3 volumes of the Southern Poetry Anthology, including a volume on Appalachia, contemporary Appalachian poetry, which came out 10 years ago this year. Kind of shocking to me to look back and see the publication date on that book, which feels like I was working on it just yesterday. I went to school at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville for my undergraduate studies. Worked with Marilyn Callett, Arthur Smith, Connie Jordan Green, some wonderful teachers there at UT Knoxville, and have always thought of that part of East Tennessee as home for me. Went off to upstate New York to do a master's degree, a Master of Fine Arts in poetry writing at Cornell University. Went to New Orleans and taught for a year at the University of New Orleans by the lakefront. Most of the poems I will read tonight are East Tennessee based, but I do have a few New York and New Orleans poems. Those places made a great impression on me. And then I came back to the University of Tennessee for a PhD in English. I did a creative writing dissertation, which I finished just before I came up here to ETSU as a professor. So I'm happy to be here with you. I wish that we were all together in West Virginia, although I have to say, I know there are a lot of you with us tonight who couldn't have made it to West Virginia. So I appreciate this opportunity to bring us all together. These have been some distressing times to get through, and we're still making our way through them. So I hope that I wish I had some funny poems. I wish I had some cheerful poems for you tonight. It's not really my forte. So I'll do my best. Maybe I'll tell some jokes in between the poems. So I really am grateful for this opportunity to share some poems and to spend some time with people who are interested in hearing about poetry. I'm gonna start with a poem that is set in Sharps Chapel, Tennessee, my home place. Every Memorial Day, we have a family reunion, a family get-together at our cemetery. One of the things we talked about today in workshop was the Gothic influence, the weird and the eerie in Appalachian literature. And I had a friend say to me once, if your family has their reunions at a cemetery, you are certainly part of the Appalachian Gothic. So I look forward to this event every year to see people, to see folks in the family and people that I may not get to see from other states who come in for this. And this year we had to cancel it, of course, because of the pandemic. And so I missed getting to see some people that I really love to see every year. So I thought I would start with this poem from my first book of poetry called Tennessee Landscape with Blighted Pine. Um, I'm going to read around in various collections. I'm mostly going to read new poems tonight, but I thought I would start with this older one just to commemorate the Memorial Day reunion that we missed this year. This one is called Johnson's Ground. We sit under the awning and watch them descend in unison, a flock of 30 or more down through the heavy rain we weren't supposed to get, pecking where grass is thin for what the moisture turns up. They look like the sound of the word grackle, these scavengers with wings muted black as painted iron rails, as wet tar, their open beaks flashing a bright citrus smear. Memorial Day weekend and the weather drives us for cover, beating down plastic flowers and darkening the family gravestones. Each year we arrive, like any family, to admire new babies and find out who's changed jobs or gotten married. I come to see who's left, to sit in the shaded chairs where my grandmother sat with her oldest sister Minnie for the last time, neither of them able to name the other, but both staring as if into a clouded mirror. In the memory of their faces, I see pillars of stone, pillars of stippled salt, where the hammer of time drives the chisel of living, the opaque blue of their eyes, each pair reflecting the other, sky blue buttons threaded through a dark blue dress. Homecoming at the cemetery. They never let us go. Even the ones laid under before our births continue to make their claims, to draw the interest on their spent lives. My grandfather waits here, a Houston buried in Johnson ground. Such is the appointment he made with them. He was dead 2 years before I was born. But who do I remind the old people of? Whose picture did I stare into above the living room fireplace? My great uncle Gene tells my father and me about the base he served in Korea, how bombs sounded hitting the village. While 100 feet away is my cousin Gary, killed in Vietnam, telling his story into our other ears, into the soles of our shoes. The foraging birds drag worms out of the ground. We pull dark meat from the bones of chicken thighs and split boiled potatoes with plastic forks. Damp air hums in our lungs and old people begin covering dishes. The rain always seeps in, even under shelter. I offer my hands one more time to the company who packs their leftovers and drives away, and to the company who stays behind under the tall grass, left in the restless turning of what we remember of them. I'll follow that with another Sharps Chapel poem. It's probably going to be the theme tonight. I've had to be away from Sharps Chapel more than ever, really, this spring because of the pandemic, and I've missed it a whole lot. And been thinking about some of these poems and how they might speak to the home places that maybe some of you are missing. This one is from my second poetry book, Basin Ghosts. Which came out in 2014. The title is an allusion. It's a literary allusion to the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins and my favorite Hopkins poem, Spring and Fall, which opens, Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove unleaving? And this poem made me think of that after I'd written it. And so I gave it the title, Golden Grove. We drift through the back fields, father and daughter, weekend visitors strolling where I was raised. In the shallow folds of the wood, bones flare up in the sun like struck match heads. Picked clean and scattered across the open meadow. The child knows we can never put these pieces back together, reassemble the young heifer lost while calving, death within a death. The girl's eyes announce that we shall not leave the unburied littered among brambles and briars, shadows of the leafless oak grove. Because sorrow's springs are the same forever, we gather the fragments and build a drumlin of bones, halcyon home to the wind, or shelter for any wayward bird. Wings beating like a heart behind a wall of bare ribcage. I think I'll read another poem with my daughter, and that one of the only real pleasures of this spring has been that our daughter has been here at home with us. Our daughter Chloe got sent home from school, got sent home from the dorm, which is just across town, but still, and has been with us. So I've been thinking about that too. I'll read a few poems from my forthcoming poetry collection. It'll be out October 1st with Mercer University Press. It's going to be called Merciful Days. So I think I'll read a New York, an upstate New York poem now. When we lived there, we were the last house right before the Cornell Lab of Ornithology bird sanctuary started. So our backyard and our side yard literally were the woods, the bird sanctuary. It was a tiny little house. You could fit the whole house probably into most of your living rooms. But we loved that house so much, and we could just sort of walk out the door and walk right into the woods and spend the whole day. And our daughter was little there. She was a baby in that house. So I feel sentimental about it. This one is called At the Window. We always kept the bird feeders full at the house by Sapsucker Woods. Even when the door would come, even when the deer would come during the night and stand on two legs to eat the seeds and suet blocks. I usually had the baby on my shoulder, pointing out the different birds that came skittering in for landing, quick mouthful, then off again. We walked like that from the window to all the picture frames on the walls, so she could reach out and tap everyone on the nose. And I'd say, bing. Then she would laugh, and we would go heat a bowl of cereal and slice bananas. I could do everything with one hand, it seemed. And sometimes we ate sitting together on the floor. We might have moved some plastic animals in circles, or looked at pictures in a book about rabbits or constellations, then gone back to the window to see whether any birds had come for brunch, or if a squirrel had climbed the feeder pole. That was my life those days. One arm forever full and wriggling, the other arm free to do anything that needed doing, like shushing away vagrant squirrels or waving off the future just a bit longer. Many of the poems in this new manuscript are about my mother, about things that we've done together, and especially things that she has said. Um, my mother's a great storyteller. She has a great way of phrasing practically everything. Um, and this poem came out of, it's a couple years old. I started it on her birthday a couple years ago. And I was thinking back to when I was little and the Challenger space shuttle exploded. That day is such a vivid memory for me. Um, and we had already had a pretty exciting morning, although it was fairly every day. It was a fairly regular morning, and yet for some reason, because of what happened later that morning, I remembered it all in such detail. So this is called Challenger, for my mother turning 76. Remember when we fed the cows from the window of the barn loft? We had the jumpy black Angus then, years before the docile polled Herefords who mill meekly about, globe-eyed. Today the sun is out, and we celebrate in short sleeves in early November, and watch for leaves to drop from red-orange maples. But that morning, blowing snow kept me home from school. We fed the square bales then, misshapen as they were, and I loved to cut the twine with the short blade of my pocket knife, taut forms loosening and scattering apart on the way to the ground below. Our mistake was to call the cows too soon, "Sicab, sicab," just as my father had said it. My father, who was on the road in hard weather, probably a 36-hour run to Harrisburg, driving through ice to get home by midnight. In half a second, it seemed, the whole herd circled beneath us, grunting and jostling. And you said, "Shit fire," which made me laugh so hard I lost my breath and could not even throw the hay out of the loft to distract them. We escaped, of course. And like so many other mornings after our chores, you said, "I think we need some biscuits, don't you?" "With apple butter," I said. And you held my collar as I climbed down the slick ladder. While cups of hot chocolate warmed our fingers, we turned to the one TV channel we could watch without static and saw a real rocket ship, like the one I wanted for Christmas, explode right on screen, again and again, in spiraling slow motion. I looked at you as I always did when I could not understand what I saw, and your mouth, frozen in mid-gasp, silently told me, on the coldest day of the year, that in a particle of that churning smoke departed the childhood I thought would last forever. So I want to read one about my grandfather, who died when I was about 9. Maybe I just turned 10. And he was kind of a character. That's my dad's dad. And he would come around and he would visit, but he wouldn't stay very long. So this poem is called "Old Man Wandering the Roads." My grandfather grafted trees and sold the shoots across 4 counties to farmers who wanted new fruit for canning, an apricot or yellow pear, a jar of late autumn to sweeten winter bread. He left a trail of growing things wherever he went, carried a little change in his pockets to prove he had done his day of work. Maybe not a lot of it, but enough to get around. Enough to buy gas for an old Ford, Coca-Cola for the road, sardines and saltines for dinner. I remember him as a talker who visited often but never stayed long, sitting shoulders forward on our couch, cradling an empty coffee cup, anxious to tell where he'd been that morning, as my father listened with his eyes cast down, trying not to notice the split seams and unlaced shoes. Old man wandering the roads, my mother said, clearing plates and cups once he was gone. And each time my father went outside with him when he left, walked him slowly to his truck, but never came straight back into the house, finding something always to do in the fields, new ground ever to break, a stump to haul away, some old animal dying and needing buried. So we talked just a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, about the Gothic and Appalachian literature this morning, and we did a folklore prompt. Everybody wrote a folklore poem, and I mentioned a few of my favorites. Darnell Arnault's The Gorilla Story, which I can't read anywhere near as engagingly as Darnell can, but we read that one and talked about Robert Morgan's poem Mountain Bride, which is to me the quintessential Appalachian folklore poem. But I also have one of these myself. Folklore has been a big part of my subject matter too. I grew up in a kind of remote place. There's stories about basically every cabin and every holler. And the one that was closest to me was about a little house just over the hill, driving toward Norris Lake. It was a pretty dark stretch of the road. This was a dirt road when I was little. So this one is called Katie Myers. We called the ridge after her, lonesome, jagged furrow that it peaked, barely level enough ground to scratch out a road. The Katie Mar was how it sounded in the olden tongue, spoken still by ones too young to recall who she was, or what she did, or how she came to be there alone, we heard, in such as that dire, dreadful, sovereign place. Never arable land, too steep for food crops, for grazing animals, but neither was it barren. Every bright kind of mountain wildflower grew there, wild phlox, columbine, mayapple. Those good for show, and those good for bile, canker, thrush mouth, and swimmy head. Bitter roots boiled down to tea, or stirred round with whiskey, rot candy, and glycerin. She was none of the Fate Myers people, or unclaimed kin if she was, those few who prospered and lived in town, who bought up all the roadside farms of the county seat. Driving her ridge at night was riding with the ghost, doing whatever she told you. Her cabin stitched right into the forest floor, windows without glass, door hanging by the bottom hinge, like some drunkard flung aside with one foot still planted firm. The shingles seemed to reach across the road toward the trees that were their ancestors. She could have lived there a century before last, if stories be trusted, if damp wood holds together in that sunless stretch of slant where black snakes drape from the shoulder, so languorously car wheels catch and grind them into strips of pink and black taffeta. Once my grandfather told of a candle wavering its lone flame in her window. Light where both sun and moon are strangers. His car first slowing down, then taking off full speed, exactly like his heartbeat. Her shadow, he hoped, left far behind. Got a few ghost stories in this new book. It's maybe a haunted collection. I wanted to read one final poem I'm going to stick around for a few minutes after finishing the poems and see if you have any questions. You can type them into the comment bar on the side there if you would like to ask anything. I'll be glad to take 2 or 3 questions after the reading. A blue tractor passing. It was a New Holland or an older model Ford that we could hear coming for half a mile before it reached the house. When I asked my mother if she recognized the driver, a stranger to me, she said, "I wish it was K.O. Campbell, and that your daddy was standing down there beside the road to throw his hand up at him." K.O. drove my school bus, in addition to the one blue tractor on Kane Road. And some years for Christmas, he brought us a bottle of his homemade wine, apple, pear, elderberry, which were the only spirits we ever kept in the house. K.O. outlived my father by just about a year, and now the Beeson family tends his orphaned herd. His bull still jumps our fence sometimes, and my nephews cross him back over while our cows bawl. Like my mother and me, these cattle keep looking for the old farmers who softly spoke their true names as they scattered salt into empty feed troughs. Thank you. I appreciate you being here tonight to share some poetry. Again, I appreciate the West Virginia Wesleyan College MFA program for inviting me to take part in their summer residency. It's been a great day. I'll be glad to answer any questions if you have them. I'm not sure that I see any coming up yet, but I'll hang on a couple minutes and see if I get them. Oh, here's a question. Where can we purchase your work? That's a great question. Thanks. All 3 of the books that I've published so far, and all my edited collections too, are on Amazon. If you just look under my name. I appreciate you asking that. The book cover for Merciful Days is posted now on the Mercer University Press website, and it's up on Amazon too. So hopefully you get to take a look at that. So as you heard, a number of those poems were East Tennessee poems, and it's one of the things we talked about in workshop today, in class this morning, is writing the stories of the place that you know best, and writing the stories of the place that that means the most to you. How do we find our authentic voice in our poems? How do we find the poem that we may not have known we needed to write? For me, that some of that involved circling back to childhood. Some of my first poems, of course, were about childhood and about where I grew up, and then I needed to work on some other things. I needed to work on some other poems, some other subject matter. A book that I didn't mention came out a couple years ago. I didn't read anything from it. It's a little bit of its own special thing. It's called Spectre Mountain. I um, co-wrote these poems with my friend and uh, my poetry soulmate, William Wright, great poet from South Carolina, living in Georgia now. Um, and we did these poems sort of back and forth a few years ago, and wrote them kind of feverishly. Sometimes I would write a poem in the morning and send it to Will, and he'd send me another one back that evening. And then we took 2 or 3 years revising them and arranging them and working on them. Didn't really read any of those tonight. They are a little bit less autobiographical, maybe, but for me, that was such an important um, new exploration of subject matter that I cared about. We tried to envision Spectre Mountain is not a real place. We're trying to do sort of a composite vision of Appalachia, um, a way of uh, thinking about the region, maybe not so much in our own autobiographical terms, which we had already both explored in our work previously, um, but to think about the geology and the geography and folklore of the place and the industry of the place and what was happening, what had happened to the people here over time and to the land um, before and while the people were here. I have a great question here from Thomas Orr. How do you know when you've struck a solid balance between narrative and imagery in your poems? And that to me is that's one of the essential craft questions about poetry. Um, I felt like this morning I was selling narrative pretty hard to the workshop because I really believe that you can get an atmosphere in your poems, a gravity in your poems, if there is some element of a story. I think readers can connect to that. I think if you have a bit of a narrative underpinning to your imagery, um, that can help a reader find their way maybe back to their own memories, maybe back to what their experiences have been. Um, I hope that if you read some of my poems that you don't just think about these as uh, my poems and think about what my experiences were, but that they will make you think about your own experiences as well, and maybe help you remember some things that you may not have thought of before. So imagery is, of course, like that's the whole like water that poetry swims in. It's really everything. Everything in the poem sort of depends on the sensory perceptions, the sensory images. Uh, so a narrative underneath that, I think, can really bring those maybe down to earth a little bit. Bring those. Um, I feel like the poems of mine that are most imagistic are also maybe the most ethereal and the most sort of up in the air. I think the narrative can ground those a little bit. Plus, I probably came to poetry through stories. I grew up in a family of storytellers. Really, I mean, not everybody. Some of them never said a word, but literally so many great talkers, so many great storytellers in my family. And my mom especially, but not just her. I had a favorite uncle named Gerald, who's the center of many of my poems. Um, died almost 20 years ago now. It's been a great absence in my life since then. Um, he was so funny. He was just the funniest person, and um, also the sweetest person too, um, which is great when those qualities come together. But he was a wonderful storyteller as well. Um, so I got that sense from both sides of the family that ended up with a lot of subject matter from them. So Michael McCarty says, will you say a word about how you differentiate between autobiographical influences and a speaker's voice as a writer? Thanks for that question, Micah. Micah is one of our ETSU MA graduates. I hope that sooner or later you will see not only some of Micah's poems, one of which is up right now on the literary journal Still, their online journal website. But I hope you'll see some of Micah's scholarship about the Kentucky poet Jim Wayne Miller sometime in the near future. So autobiographical influences and the speaker's voice, I do try to differentiate those. I do try, especially when I'm teaching poetry class, we want to talk about the speaker of the poem and not the poet, because you don't want to assume that everything that the poet says is autobiographical, everything that the poet writes. We got to talk about that a little bit in class too this morning, about narrative poems that are characterizations. There are many great verse novels that tell stories of time periods or different places that had nothing to do with the speaker's own lives. And I love those so much. I love being able to time travel that way. My old professor, Robert Morgan, has a phrase about what reading offers us, but I think it's also what writing can offer us too. And I hope that if you aren't writing poems every day already, that you'll think about the poems that you might like to write, even if you choose not to write them. I hope that it'll maybe give you some ideas to think about. Robert Morgan talks about how reading and writing can create a community across time. And to me, that's so important, because once we read about other times and other places, I feel like it helps us feel less alone in the world now, less sort of stranded in our own experiences. And I think that's especially poignant in times like these, which are difficult and continue to be difficult. And it can be helpful to see how people have handled their own difficult situations in other times and in other places. So I'm a real believer in that idea of community across time. And I think you can find that in a speaker's voice. You can also write that into a speaker's voice. So Emily Price writes, how have you sustained your writing during this difficult time? And Emily is one of our outstanding ETSU students as well. I think I speak for the whole department when I say she's one of our best ever. And I wish I had a better answer for this, Emily, because I've not found it all that easy to sustain my writing during this time. I've probably written a little less than I would normally like to have done. I hope that maybe in sharing that if you haven't done as much writing, any of you out there who are still watching, if you haven't done as much writing or painting or working in your garden or whatever you usually do to make meaning in your life, I hope that you'll feel okay about that. This time is maybe not unprecedented in the history of the world, but it's certainly unprecedented in our lifetimes. So how do we work our way through it? So I feel like probably a lot of us are wishing we were doing more of the things that we loved and that meant a lot to us. I think it's also just it's what's nice about getting to share our conversations like this, and to get to see so many great comments in the margins. I really appreciate all those. I didn't realize I could scroll down for a long time. Of course, I was busy reading poems. but I've been able to scroll back up and read some of these. And I'm delighted to see Marianne Worthington is with us, and she posted Micah's poem from Still. Marianne is the poetry editor for Still, the journal, which is one of the great online journals. It's one of the ones I always when I know it's getting time for a new issue, I always start checking the website to see if it's out yet. So hope you'll visit that site. And if you are a poet or a writer with connections to Appalachia, I hope maybe you'll find that to be a venue for good reading, and also maybe to submit some of your own writing. So let's see, I'm looking to see if there are any other questions. I'm really grateful for the ones that we've had. So I don't see any more. If I'm missing any, my apologies. So again, I'm really grateful to you all for being here, watching and sharing tonight, and really happy to have gotten to spend this time with the students and the faculty and at West Virginia Wesleyan College. And I hope you all have a great week. I'll mention one more time, they have some fantastic writers with them this week reading. So I hope that you'll check back in at 8 o'clock every night this week and hear from them. So I'll sign off. I'll say good night and have a great week. Thank you.